And get starting. Hello, everyone. Greetings, salutations, everyone. Alan, it's been a while. Regular returning guest, everyone. Alan, expert on Iran and previous. I always want to make sure I get this right. You were previously part of the JCPOA negotiations, or you were the negotiator, or you were the lead negotiator.
I was not the lead negotiator. There was a huge team, but yeah, I was on it for the whole 5 years. I was the Iran subject matter expert for the negotiating team, and also for the State Department, its Persian language spokesperson for 5 years. But the team was headed by the Assistant Secretary of State for Political Affairs, Wendy Sherman, and had a huge cast of characters on it, like 10 other people.
Okay. That clears that up then, everyone. No, all right. So, Alan, what is going on right now? We have threats of Bab el-Mandeb being closed. We've got the Strait of Hormuz continuing to look like a complete shit show. We've got, what's the name of it? Peak View. I forget the name of the mountain. Yes, that's Trump likes the look of that now, even though he doesn't have the abilities to actually destroy the base, let alone reach it. What do you think of everything that's transpired in the past 24, 48 months?
The backdrop of all of this is the massive strategic incompetence of the U.S. administration. You know, they're not playing four-dimensional chess. They're not playing chess. They're not playing checkers. They're playing tic-tac-toe and consistently losing. So it's a little depressing. What happened? The memorandum of understanding was ambiguous. That in itself was not fatal. If there were a modicum of mutual trust or goodwill, that could have been dealt with. But because there wasn't, then the ambiguities within the MOU, to include Article 5 and the Strait of Hormuz, became debilitating because Iran has as one of its red lines its ongoing control of the strait, which for that is literally the hill they're going to die on, or at least one of the hills that they're willing to die on. So they were attacking ships going through the strait on the hugging the Omani coast. The U.S. retaliated, it escalated, and now it threatens to escalate even further because once again, President Trump, to a man with a $1 trillion defense budget, everything looks like it has a military solution. So he is contemplating escalating in the hopes that Iran will do that which it is almost certain not to do, which is move its red lines regarding the Strait of Hormuz. And let's not even talk about the nuclear issue, which is,
well, that was going to be my next question, but all right, let's not talk about it. Moving on.
I'm happy.
No, I'm teasing you, but no, I do want to focus on the, shall we say, aquatic theatre first, and then sort of turn back to the nuclear file in a minute. But we have reports from Reuters, this exclusive article, maybe you read it. I made a video on it earlier for those watching if they're interested. And this is a pretty alarming development that the Iranians are going to activate, quote unquote, the Houthis to terrorize, to intercept, disrupt the Bab el-Mandeb, right? I'm always going to mispronounce that phrase. I just prefer to say the Gulf of Aden, to be honest. It's much more memorable. Well, they're going to be disrupting the Gulf of Aden, and therefore maritime flows up through the Suez Canal. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, again, Iran has various degrees of operational control over what people in the West call its proxies. I think it's the closest overlap of strategic interests is between Hezbollah and Iran, and the weakest is between the Houthis and Iran. You add to that the fact that I think the Saudis were paying off the Houthis to sit this one out, but in the last couple of days that changed. The Saudis attacked a Yemeni airport because they said Iran was landing a plane to resupply. Iran was saying that Mahan Air flight was actually returning people from the funeral of Khamenei. Regardless, it touched off a mini escalation between the Saudis and the Houthis, who have been relatively conflict-free for the last couple of years. So it could well be that the Houthis decide to threaten maritime traffic in the Bab el-Mandeb, irrespective of what's going on with Iran. But then you also have Iran saying, yes, we're going to ask our Houthi brothers to close the strait. Whatever the proximate cause is, there's a significantly increased chance that the Bab el-Mandeb will come into play? And if so, I don't need to tell you, then the compound economic stressors from having two straits in that part of the world either closed or significantly shut down are considerable.
Yeah, but can't we just agree, Alan, that the capacity for the Houthis to be a potent threat is overblown?
It's easy to close the Strait of Hormuz. It's a lot easier to close the Bab el-Mandeb just because of the geography. So, it's axiomatic. The U.S. military cannot keep the Strait of Hormuz open through military force. That's even more true about the Bab el-Mandeb. So, if the Houthis want it closed, it will be closed, or at least significantly constrained.
But again, how are they going to do that? They seem very reluctant to utilize their own weaponry. The only time they had any action during the past few months was when they shot, I think, literally one missile towards Israel, which was obviously intercepted. And they show a general reluctance to want to utilize their stockpiles. So why would they suddenly start utilizing these? Well, this is a maritime operation, and therefore it's a completely different operation.
No, I'm not saying they will. I'm just saying the two salient facts that have happened in the last week, each of them increase the possibility that the Houthis will. One is the resumption of hostilities between Saudi and the Houthis, and the second is Iran contemplating escalation by closing the strait. It could be that Iran has sufficient presence at Bab el-Mandeb to close it themselves with their own weaponry. So I'm not saying, I'm not Chicken Little here, say the sky is falling. I'm just saying it's statistically more likely that the Bab el-Mandeb becomes closed than it was a week or so ago.
And we had a guest on the show yesterday who I was arguing about the capacity for the United States to operate in both theaters. You're saying even if they could operate, they're not going to be able to do anything to make a difference.
Well, we can operate in every theater in the world. Again, we've got a $1 trillion military. Can we keep either the Bab el-Mandeb or the Strait of Hormuz open? No, we can't. Period.
So what happens then? The Iranians activate the Houthis, they respond.
If the Bab el-Mandeb becomes closed or significantly constrained, I would guess the financial markets freak out, for lack of a better economic term. They're already slowly awakening to a threat that I think they've underestimated. I think a lot of the Trump happy talk has becalmed the financial markets, despite the fact that our economic resilience is less now as we draw down the SPR and other reasons. You look at diesel crack spreads and the 3-to-1 ratio, and it's historic highs. So, yeah, what would happen? I don't know, but it would be bad.
Whew, all right. Well, smiles all around, everyone. I guess peak oil is on the way back. Alan, so, all right. Does this mean that the Iranians are fully investing in their true nuclear option then?
No, I mean, they're not worried about nuclear now. That's down the road. There's been some desultory activity at nuclear facilities, but, they're fighting a war for their existence. Now is not the time to reconstitute their nuclear program. There's no possible upside in doing so. So any move they do in that regard.
I was talking about a nuclear option being the Strait of Hormuz, the geography.
Yeah. You know what? Are they going to build a nuclear weapon in time to save them? No. So what's the point? Again, to the extent that they're moving around their nuclear facilities, it's a signaling move, which I think is probably counterproductive because it just invites, Israel and the U.S. to have justification to bomb their nuclear facilities. Let's not forget, this war has done nothing to adversely impact Iran's nuclear facilities. Those were taken out in June of last year. And Iran, since June of last year, has taken no significant steps to reconstitute their nuclear infrastructure. So this war was not mowing the lawn or mowing the grass, whatever Israel calls it.
All right, so let's look at the intricacies within the Islamic Republic then. we've had in the past couple of days a real exposure of the shift in the I think sentiment in Iran, right? There was a lot of argument, some people saying, correct me if I'm wrong, whether this is over analysis, but some people have said that the moderates won it out over the sort of hardliners, and moderates debate about whether or not they should engage the United States, always just keep to wartime, or this was always part of the plan. It was always to lure the US into some sort of false sense of security with a peace deal, and then actually the Iranians want them to go back to war because it means they can outlast them in this way.
Well, as Ghalibaf said in his statement 2 days ago, they're not mutually exclusive. They see diplomacy and war as two fronts of the same battle. So, yeah, they're open to diplomacy. They're always open to diplomacy. And there hasn't been any seismic change in the prevailing views of the Iranian leadership since we killed Khamenei. Okay? This is a wartime government. They're fighting as best they can. One of the reasons they want control of the strait is to establish leverage, and some long-term strategic deterrence, because they envision the U.S. and Israel continuing to try to topple, destabilize, dethrone the Islamic Republic. So it's not an either-or thing, To me, what's significant has happened the last couple of days. The U.S. has started attacking some infrastructure. They're blowing up bridges around Bandar Abbas. We had that flurry of happy talk 2 or 3 days ago when the Iran released an American hostage who'd been there since December 2024, I think. So again, Iran is perfectly capable of pursuing diplomacy and, threatening to escalate. Like Mohsen Rezai said today, he said, if the U.S. keeps messing around, we will start waging an offensive war. And again, you have to discount some sort of bellicosity, but clearly Iran is conscious of the fact that it is under-responding to U.S. escalation, and so wants to make a point while still preserving some sort of escalation space for the future.
Well, yeah, that was sort of what I wanted to go to next, because the word that seems to be the word of the year, at least in geopolitical analysis, I think, will be awarded to escalation. Escalation ladder, escalation trap. How far can we escalate before we sort of run out of what it means to have escalated, right? We talk about horizontal versus vertical. Most people I've listened to in the past days argue that it's horizontal escalation because Iran is striking more American bases in Kuwait, Bahrain, Jordan, etc. But can we be more definitive on what it means to escalate?
Yeah, escalation means more military activity, so it's a quantitative and a qualitative. You fire more rockets, you fire more missiles, you do it against a greater degree of targets. For the U.S., escalation is war crimes, taking out desal plants, electrical plants, and bridges, which President Trump is threatened to do. For the Iranians, escalation is taking out GCC infrastructure. They already fired at the Bahrain-Saudi bridge. They're doing there was something in Kuwait they hit. So, there's a natural limit, though, God forbid, the U.S. has the option to go nuclear. Even President Trump hasn't, I think, mentioned that yet. But there's still significant capabilities to escalate, which is the U.S. can go after infrastructure and try to collapse Iranian society, which I think is a significant threat. And Iran can take out GCC energy infrastructure.
You're right there. Do you need some water? I myself have been struggling with a persistent cough as well today. So.
Well, look, we've got an AQI of 240 here. We've got the Canadian smoke. It's very unhealthy to go outside. So welcome to the poly crisis.
Oh, are you near all that Canadian smoke? Yeah, I was just hanging out with Canadian friends who are telling me how bad it is in Toronto right now. I'm meant to be going later in the year. Goodness. Well, I hope, stay inside, get a humidifier, whatever it is, if that helps. I'm not a public health expert, as you can tell, guys, but clearly I'm missing something about Iran as well here, Alan. See that great tangent, that pivot back to the
segue. Very good segue.
Yeah.
You're good at that.
No, I'm good at this. This is what happens, right? You get talking about stuff and you're like, oh, I've got on a tangent. How do I get back? And just like, how does Trump get back? I did another one. How does Trump get back in charge of this situation?
He was never in charge. He was never in charge. That's the defining characteristic of this event, is that this U.S. administration is not competent. So whether you're putting on a Band-Aid or doing open heart surgery, there's a greater than normal chance that this administration will mess up. Okay? There's a lot of reasons for that, but if you had a competent U.S. administration, it would still be very hard to extricate ourselves from this. It's a lot harder with the Trump administration. So, again, what should the administration do? That's easy. They should get the GCC to work with Iran on some sort of administrative infrastructure for the Strait in the short term and then pull out. Okay? Just declare victory, cut our losses and leave, and let Oman and Iran and possibly the whole GCC administer the Strait. Yes, it leaves it open for Iran to do tolling or service charges, whatever, but that could be unavoidable in the short term. The hope is in the medium to long term, with enough pressure, that goes away. But the reality is Iran needs strategic deterrence and it needs a source of income. Iran, there's a great article in Foreign Affairs about how badly the Trump administration does coercion, and that's what's happening now. We have been unable to use coercion effectively because for coercion to work, there has to be a commensurate hope that if you do the right thing, the pressure goes away. And at this point, the Iranians are saying the pressure is not going to go away. So they're not willing to capitulate. They would if they thought it could save the regime, much like Khomeini drank from the poison chalice and accepted the ceasefire resolution in 1988. But this Iranian regime can't trust President Trump and the U.S. administration on what it commits to. So that's why diplomacy is such a thin reed to hang on to in terms of our hopes.
Positive sentiments here, everybody. Alan, you're always such a great.
I can make us happier if you want. I can totally, this is U.S. strategy. It's working. Iran will capitulate. President Trump announced the Strait is fully open. Let's go with that. Strait's fully open.
All right, guys, we'll be right back after this Fox News advert. No, look, so what I wanted to say was, first, that you took me a little bit too literally there, or maybe I didn't word it as definitively as I should have done. All I'm trying to say with the Trump decision-making right now is that we've had a month, literally to the day of this MOU being signed, and within a week, 2 weeks, it was dead. Yep. Now we're back where we were before, and we're going so far back that what is the assessment within the White House right now? From my understanding, Trump is considering anything from trying to take Khark Island again to striking this bunker base in the mountain to a couple of other areas. But to quote the Wall Street Journal, which I think reported this yesterday, they basically said Trump is reluctant to commit ground troops, but it's not off the table. Are we seriously back here again, 4 months on? Are we seriously back to this sort of rhetoric?
I do not have an effective working model of President Trump's decision-making apparatus. To me, it's prima facie obvious that putting boots on the ground is a spectacularly bad idea that will result in significant U.S. deaths. President Trump himself said that. He said something to the effect that, we don't need to go in, other people will go in. Is he referring to the Baluch? Is he referring to the Kurds? I don't know. Again, I've long since stopped paying granular attention to President Trump's statements because they're largely not indicative of what the U.S. will do. So I would not think that, well, no, I take that back. it could well be we're seriously considering occupying Karg Island. That would be a mistake.
American personnel sitting ducks for
Yeah.
America, for drone
That
strikes.
would give Iran what it wants, the chance for televised body bags, landing at Dover Air Force Base. But it would also theoretically increase Iranian economic pressure. But here's the key point, or a key point. There might not be a sweet spot where the U.S. exercises enough catastrophic economic pressure whereby the IRGC capitulates and Iran continues sort of at a functioning level. It could well be that, again, the Iranians could be overplaying their hand, and the IRGC, for their own reasons, it is in fact an oligarchy, resists, and then we get regime collapse, which just means a step decrease in the Iranian regime's ability to provide goods and services to large parts of its population. The Baluch maybe take up arms. The Kurds start firing. There are protests in many of the major Iranian cities. So, the U.S. can put enough economic pressure and enough kinetic pressure on Iran for it to essentially, collapse. And I just mean by collapse, just decrease in complexity and efficiency. The problem is two problems. One, you have a failed state of 93 million people. And two, before that happens, the Iranian regime could cause a lot of damage in the region in terms of taking out GCC infrastructure, energy infrastructure, among other things.
So you made one interesting point, which I
made one interesting point. Yes.
It's a tough sell, everyone. It takes so long to be impressed. I'm not, some other hosts here. It's it's a high quality caliber.
There you go. What was my good point?
Alan, no, I'm glad to have you brought into the chamber of legends. But no, let's put it this way. I was making the point earlier this week, which is I kind of lose. I don't see the point of looking at the granular details. Sometimes losing the forest for the trees, so to speak. In that, there's maybe it's because we're diplomatic / geopolitical analysts. I don't want to mislabel you if you don't use that term yourself, but military analysts, they look at the rockets fired, they look at the units involved, they look at the day-to-day, minute by minute updates on flight radar. Now, that's all important, and don't get me wrong, my background is in strategic studies, but at the same time, none of these things, in the same way as the shifts on the battlefield, quote unquote, in the war in Ukraine, make much of a difference in the big picture. Ultimately, these two are in a game of chicken, they are at a standoff, and nothing at the larger scale is really shifting. So my question to you simply is, what does it take? What would be an actual shock event, an inflection point, which would make us see a significant shift in what seems to be this new normal of tit for tat?
Well, yeah, I think things have shifted. I think, because the Strait of Hormuz has been closed or constricted for months, the economic resilience of the United States has decreased appreciably. We can talk about how close the strategic petroleum reserves are to tank bottoms, the reservoirs at Cushing, Oklahoma. We can talk about how much longer China can, pretty much keep the world afloat. We can talk about, again, as we talked about, the fact that prices for diesel, for gasoline are starting to move up, and the discrepancy between them and the price of crude oil, which shows shortages, is starting to increase. So that's one thing, and that shows cumulative pressure on the global economy. And also, even though Iran, as a result of this ceasefire, was able to push out, 90 million barrels, and they still have a lot of barrels outside the blockade line, so it's given Iran a breather. Still, there are serious cumulative effects on the Iranian economy. Now, I've already said that the people running Iran, that's not the final word for them. They're not going to look at a balance sheet necessarily and say, okay, it's time for us to quit. But still, it has an effect. So what's going to change the calculus of either the U.S. or Iran? It's going to be primarily economic. We saw 2 or 3 days ago, Iran Wire released a putatively confidential Iranian polling report showing, how Iranians are looking at things. And even though it was pretty much conform with what one would expect, it did show that, radicals on both ends, dissolution of the Islamic Republic of Iran and 100% supporters are a minority, 15, 20% at each end, right? So the majority of Iranians, want extensive change in their political system and are very unsatisfied on a whole, on a wide variety of fronts. But it's not as apocalyptic, and as this regime does have some support. And there are a lot of Iranians who, even though they're not huge fans of the regime, are scared of drastic change and chaos and collapse.
Yeah, I think we saw from the previous polls and reactions to the elections over the years that the opposition to the government, please correct me if I'm wrong, but was more about the corruption or the internal misdealings, the mismanagement over the economy, not an entire disgust with the whole system as a whole. There was a lot of frustration over Raisi and his governance style. So I think it's pretty clear. Now, I'll put it to you like this then. Those images that we saw over the past days in light of Ali Khamenei's funeral processions, how inflated were they? How accurate? Or is it impossible to tell what the genuine sentiment is on the ground amongst Iranians in terms of their turnout and attendance? Well,
look, the Iranian regime, the Nizam, which is the system, let's call it the system, is always able to put bodies out in the street, right? They're able to mobilize and rally. So that's one fact. Two, you're not going to see, photos of empty streets. You're going to see, they're going to take pictures where the people are, right? So there's sort of a selection bias. But it is, in fact, the case that lots of people like the guy. You're in a country with 93 million people. If you say, 1/5 are supporters of the regime, do the math. That's roughly 20 million people. So, I don't think those were doctored photos. I think there was a huge outpouring of Iranians mourning the Khamenei, just like I think there was a significant outpouring of Iranians in the streets, in December 28th through January 9th, protesting this government's inability to provide, what government should, and many of them got killed.
So explain to me one thing. I'm reading here that the semi-official Tasnim news agency says Iranian forces attacked a Thai flag vessel attempting to transit the Strait of Hormuz, whilst the deputy governor of Bushehr says the US attacked an Iranian oil tanker docked at Karg Island. So firstly, what's your take on that development? But more specifically, something I've always wondered but never actually forgot to ask experts like yourself, which is, what's the difference between official media news agency and semi-official?
Officials related to the administration of the government. So like IRNA, the Islamic Republic News Agency, is official. Okay? Sado Sima, Voice and Vision, is official. Then you've got a whole coterie of semi-official, which are affiliated with different factions or with the IRGC, like Fars, like Mayor, semi-official. Then you have ordinary newspapers that could be, moderate to reformist to hardcore, like Kayhan, traditional conservative. Tasnim is affiliated with the IRGC, Javan, IRGC, Raja with Pyotr. So all these news services have ideological affiliations. So what you have to do is you just have to read the whole spectrum of them to get a good fix for roughly where things are. But, you can do that. That's what's great about following Iran. If you can read Persian, or these days you could probably get it translated with AI or something, you can get a good granular feel for what's at least the sort of the main issues being talked about and who's where.
Wow, it's more complicated than the British media and ideological alignment. I have to be honest. I thought the Overton window was quite complicated in the West.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. So
sense of British media, I leave that to you.
Well, just go and watch Yes Minister, I think.
But I do love The Guardian. Let's give major props to The Guardian as long as we're talking about British media. Respect.
Okay. All right. Well, you've just revealed a lot about yourself there, Alan. I think to some of my viewers. No, I think the Guardian is very good for investigative journalism for certain.
Their climate coverage is unbelievable.
Are you a resident climate expert as well, Alan? We'll have to have another conversation about that with you at some point.
That's my main issue. That's all I care about these days. Iran is irrelevant. I mean, I do this because I know a lot about Iran, but if you're racking and stacking world problems, Iran isn't even on the short list. Climate and the other planetary systems that we've thrown out of whack are. But we can save that for another day.
All right, guys, that will be the title of this episode. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share. Iran is irrelevant, according to ex-JCPOA negotiator Alan. All right, Alan. So what are we expecting now? Tonight seems like a relatively quiet night. The war started on a Friday evening, early Saturday morning. So why is it that some days are more intense with strikes compared to others? Is there a certain routine that comes with this, or is the Trump administration literally just doing whatever they feel like day after day? I know what you said earlier, but is there any remnants of a strategy in the U.S. administration?
I think a lot of times what President Trump does depends on what days the market are open or closed. So I would think the only attention he pays to the various diurnal and weekly cycles have to do with the market. You know, and when he makes announcements, we're already seeing that a lot of announcements that President Trump makes and his administration are made to move markets. We've seen Trump officials making serious buck because they have foreknowledge of significant policy announcements coming out. So I assume that President Trump and his cabal are making at least some of these announcements and decisions based on ability to profit in the markets.
All right, so and I've left one of the most, I think, concerning, alarming elements to all of this. Now, you may well water it down or say that it's irrelevant, but the targeting more and more of what the Iranians interpret and categorize as civilian infrastructure, so airports, bridges, power facilities. The concern about this, from my understanding, is that this will lead to a unrestricted, unrestrained hellfire on other parts of the Middle East. The New York Times even stating, that this could be precipice of regional war, and more specifically, so infrastructure like desalination plants, critical infrastructure in the Saudi, Emirati Gulf states, which are obviously incredibly reliant, and why we haven't seen them getting more involved in supporting the US campaign against Iran. How accurate do you think that is? And if it is accurate, what does it mean for Iran's, leverage?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not underplaying that. I'm very concerned because it's clear, unlike the U.S., Iran usually means what it says. And Iran has said, if you attack our infrastructure, you take out our bridges, our desal plants, our power plants, it's going to get a lot worse. And again, they're making, they attack military bases, but they realize that's not really moving the dial for President Trump. If a U.S. military base in Qatar gets hit, or in Jordan gets hit, President Trump doesn't care. If Muwafaq Air Base in Jordan is hit, right? Is that the name of it? I'm blanking. But yeah, he doesn't care. But you start taking out energy infrastructure with the immediate effect that would have on global financial markets, then you're getting the United States' attention. So that's the obvious tripwire danger here, which is if, in fact, the U.S., out of pique or frustration, decides to escalate, because up until now, what they've been doing is primarily attacking coastal military facilities, trying to degrade Iran's ability to threaten maritime traffic, which they are doing, but not sufficiently, and they can't sufficiently because it takes so little military threat to threaten maritime traffic to the Strait. But if they escalate to these war crimes, and they are war crimes, not that anyone cares about that these days, then the obvious response for Iran is to start going after, not just American bases and, in these GCC countries, but also energy infrastructure, like they did at Ras Laffan, taking out 15% of Qatar's ability to export LNG for 3 to 5 years.
So, all right, but this feels to me like such a crux of the whole issue. This is the escalation that I was sort of joking about earlier. This is a genuine level of escalation, a vertical escalation that the Iranians are restraining from doing, and could at any point genuinely do and intensify the conflict, put the conflict in a level that is beyond any sense of return, and one that the United States can't somehow damage control. They can't help prevent the Iranians from dealing so much damage to the Gulf states.
We don't know that, though. We don't know. I mean, it could be. Again, we always have to be conscious of what we don't know. You know, I lost my access to top secret information when I retired from the government. I assume you do not currently have top secret clearance. So there could be, whatever. There could be information we're not seeing that President Trump is seeing that gives him greater assurances. You know, Iran could have much fewer rockets, missiles, fast attack craft than has been leaked out. Now, I don't think this is the case because there's so many leakers in the U.S. government that sort of information would be leaked. But I don't want to thoroughly discount the possibility.
All right. So then, well, I'll summarize my last question by paraphrasing that from a viewer. Is this just where we are indefinitely at this point?
Yes.
And when does something change?
Yeah. Susan Maloney gave a good interview a while ago. She's always good, but yeah, she said, you know, this could continue for the foreseeable future, this sort of neither full-scale war or full-scale peace. And don't forget, if it's not full-scale peace for a long time, the Strait doesn't go back to normal. So, you know, the Strait of Hormuz is like a pinball machine on tilt, and it's going to take a lot for that to go away. You know, there's a certain stickiness to risk and fear, and the insurers, the ship owners, the cargo owners, you know, they need more than a couple of good days, right, for the logistics supply chains to work themselves back to the way they were, to start sending ships not, you know, back into the Strait. So I think we'll continue this way, you know, for at least a couple of weeks. I hope I'm wrong. You know, I assume there's back channel negotiations going on. The Qataris, the Pakistanis, the Turks, the Egyptians, passing messages. You know, both sides want to avoid escalation. That is clear. Trump does not want to escalate. Iran doesn't want to escalate. They're both signaling that, but they also both, you know, it's a prisoner's dilemma here, because each side has to escalate if it sees the other escalating.
But that conflicts quite significantly with the piece I read by Vali Nasser. You may know of him, and maybe agree with his opinions. But he was saying that this is what the Iranians want. They don't want to be in peacetime. They want to be maybe not in wartime, but in my third favorite term I learned only recently was conflictual situation time.
Well, yeah, I haven't read his piece that people are talking about now. But yeah, much like, you know, Ayatollah Khomeini during the Iran-Iraq War said, "In jang b'ray ma ne'mat est." This war for us is a blessing, because it allowed him to consolidate his control on, you know, the fractious factions that were existing immediately after the 1979 revolution. It allowed him to strengthen his grip on power. And that's true to an extent now with the IRGC, right? But they're also, the collective nizam, the system in Iran, is aware of the risk of overplaying their hand. So, yeah, no, they don't want, you know, they've got conflict with the U.S. That's not going away. They don't need Tehran carpet bombed for the Iranian people to realize the U.S. and Israel are attacking, okay? One of the many bad things this war has done is that it has validated the official narrative that the IRGC has, which is the U.S. government doesn't give a rat's behind about the Iranian people. it wants to topple the Islamic Republic because we're independent, and it and Israel are going to keep hacking away at that kinetically, non-kinetically, cyber, financial, until we go away. So, yeah, Valley Nass is right, is that the people in power now, and it is a fluid political situation because the guy who ran the country since 1989 was just killed. So the leadership relationships and interrelationships haven't achieved stability and homeostasis, but that doesn't mean they want to continue the war at heightened levels regardless of the consequences. Because let's not forget, the blockade on Iranian ports was a sucking chest wound, okay? It got their attention. It hadn't worked in the sense that it had caused the Iranians to capitulate, bend the knee, kiss the ring, and accept U.S. red lines, but it was a significant threat. And the clock gets sort of set back to zero to an extent. Now that we've reinstalled the blockade, they've gotten a lot of oil out. They've increased their storage capacity. They've made some money, though not a lot. But still, they're not looking willy-nilly for an incessant supply of major league U.S. kinetic activity against Iran.
Breaking is the IRGC says 2 oil tankers have exploded after hitting mines in the Strait of Hormuz. Is this?
Yeah.
That's just going to happen. I mean, we don't. That's literally just been announced now by AFP. But
yeah, it's not as if shippers were saying let's charge through. So that's just another data point for the maritime insurance industry and shippers and cargo owners to say not today. Now, most of the ships who were stuck behind this, in the Persian Gulf, have gotten out, right? So, those barrels are heading toward ports as we speak. But, here's the key question. The Strait of Hormuz is safe and operating again when ships start going in. When you get to 100 and 130 ships a day, at its peak during the ceasefire, it was 35 to 40 ships a day, okay? And that constriction, it doesn't have to be fully closed. Your veins and arteries don't have to be fully closed, right? If they're constricted, if the flow of blood is insufficient, bad things happen to your body. If the Strait of Hormuz continues at 30 to 40 ships a day, which for now is optimal, beyond our wildest success, that's still not enough. There's still cumulative damage being done.
Would the Israelis and Americans improve their relations were the Iranians to activate the Houthis? Would Trump call on the Israelis to tackle the Houthis if they were activated?
I don't think so. I mean, the Israelis are chomping at the bit to get back and to restart this war kinetically. They don't want to stand down against Hezbollah. They certainly don't want to stand down against Iran. They want to topple the Islamic Republic. But for now, since they haven't been attacked, and I assume President Trump is telling them to not reinitiate hostilities against Iran. But if the Bab el-Mandab gets shut down or significantly constricted, I mean, it already is constricted, what can the Israelis do? They're not going to reopen it, All
right. Food for thought there. Alan, of the JCPOA, of climate change, of many a hat. Thank you so much for your time today. Everyone, do check out Alan's great work and writings. And of course, if you did enjoy the conversation, smash that like button, subscribe so you know when we have our next conversation. It was stellar, top quality. And you won't find, I think, that level anywhere else. But we'll see you all soon. Take care out there.
Thank you.